The bombers were swimming upwards, ignoring their assigned heights. Most pilots that night kept their noses trimmed skywards and let the technical limitations of their machines decide the altitude at which they turned the trim wheels back to normal. Some of the older Sterlings could not get above 11,000 feet. Even the best ones at 18,000 were not above the extreme range of the 8.8 centimeter flak. The two-motor Wellingtons, however, of even older design, could all do better than this, and the best of them, at nearly 24,000 feet, were flying higher than any other planes in the stream. Lambert had pushed Dorr to nearly 21,000 feet. Now he trimmed the controls so that the plane was flying hands-off and turned on the automatic pilot. He felt the elevators kick as it engaged. He had corrected course for the changing wind, so they had crossed the British coast at the prescribed assembly point. In his curtained cabin, Kocher watched the shape of the pulses on the scope of the G and calculated their position from its map. He penciled a dot upon his plotting chart and calculated how much longer it would take until they were over the target. 50 minutes to Toti, he announced. They had entered Luftwaffe Fighter Grid Square, Heinz Emil 4, although they had no way of knowing that. Now they were at the front of the bomber stream. That was no great navigational achievement. The stream was an unwieldy slab of bombers flying as much as 15 miles to either side of the penciled route. It was timed to be nearly 200 miles long. So while Creaking Door was over the North Sea, the rearmost aircraft was only just taking to the air. Tonight, visibility was poor, and only the sound of 2,800 high-performance engines marked their track. Each of those engines required the manufacturing capacity of 40 simple car engines. The man-hours spent constructing each four-motor aeroplane would have built almost a mile of autobahn. The radar and radio equipment alone equaled 1 million radio sets. The total of hard aluminium amounted to 5,000 tons, or about 11 million saucepans. In cash, at 1943 prices with profits pared to a minimum, each Lancaster cost £42,000. Crew training averaged out at £10,000 each battalion, and at that time, more than enough to send the entire crew to Oxford or Cambridge for 3 years. Add another £13,000 for bombs, fuel, servicing, and ground crew training at bargain prices, and each bomber was a public investment of £120,000, without including the oboe mosquitoes, the nuisance raid on Berlin, the OTU planes, dropping leaflets upon Ostend, training flights, transport jobs, or any of Coastal Command's activities. This bombing fleet cost £85 million. 6 bombers had already landed, the Boomerangs. Most aircrew hated to abort, for unless they bombed the target, the trip didn't count towards their tour. One Lancaster had got as far as the coast when a radiator leak caused the port inner to disappear in a cloud of steam. A Sterling had a faulty radio, and the pilot of a Wellington was suffering from stomach pains. The latter turned back just before the Dutch coast. One Lancaster taking off from an airfield near Lincoln bounced badly enough to smash the undercarriage. One wheel went through a barn roof and was unable to retract its landing gear when in the air. Its fuel jettison device failed too. It was still circling its base under orders from flying control. When enough of its fuel had been used up to achieve safe landing weight, it would try a landing. At Warley Fen, John Munro managed a perfect takeoff in spite of a tire blowout. He'd corrected the resultant swing effortlessly, and 2 of the crew didn't notice anything unusual. His problem would arise on his return. Creaking Door. Sweet. The Volkswagen and Joe for King were all within half a mile of each other, with Lambert 2,000 feet above the others, although on this dark night, the only person to know that was the radar operator at Ermin, who watched the blips slide across his screen. Lambert was as high as the plane would go, and the control column was mushy and insensitive in his hands. High above him, almost touching the stratosphere, he could see long, wispy cirrus clouds. At the moment they weren't lying along the wind direction, but the wind would continue to back until they were They heralded rain. But Lambert's interest in the clouds was a more immediate one and warned of a more immediate danger. The clouds glowed white and luminous, spotlit by a bright moon that had not yet appeared over the horizon. Soon it would appear, and the sky would lighten, and the mantle of night would start to go at the elbows. The Freya radar warned the smaller, more accurate Würzburg of the stream's route. Its three-man crew complained of the cold, as they always did, and tilted the mirror until suddenly 4 blips. Door. Sweet. The Volkswagen and Joe for King slid across the hooded radar scope. The number 1 operator missed 3 spots of light, but held the 4th one and tuned to it. Inside the warm, dark plotting room, August held his breath like an angler when the float twitches. "Red Würzburg has a contact, sir," said Willy Reinecker, "in Heinz Emil 4. It was as August had predicted. He compared the blue spot of light that marked Löwenhertz's night fighter. It was about 10 miles away from the red one. Question. Your altitude and bearing. Katze 1, said August as a double check. It was Sachs, the radar man in the back seat, who replied, Löwenhertz, hearing the call, turned his instrument panel illumination to minimum and leaned close to the black windscreen. He could hear the wind buffeting the hinges and fixtures. Order, Caruso 10 left. Katze 1, said August. Löwenhertz touched the rudder bar. He knew that he must comply with every instruction immediately it was given, for the heavy Junkers, with its clumsy aerial array, was not much faster than a Lancaster. For the same reason, its stalling speed was higher. It's a parallel head-on intercept, said August. I'll bring him in slightly to the north of the Tommy. Announcing boring cinema, said Löwenhertz. It was code for poor visibility. Willy Reinecker gave a little splutter of indignation. They are always complaining. He followed the moving points of light across the frosted glass table, marking their progress with a wax pencil so that the converging courses could be seen. In spite of the dimmed lights, August could see that the plotting room had begun to fill up with off-duty personnel who wanted to see the excitement. Prepare, 180-degree turn, said August. That's clear, crackled Löwenhertz's acknowledgement. A starboard turn, August explained to Willy. If he turns to port, he'll pass close enough across his front for the Tommy to spot him. By now, Löwenhertz had become a part of the machinery. It was August who was flying the plane. August looked round the plotting room at the expectant faces. Some of the men were in overcoats thrown over pyjamas, their hair awry and faces stubbly. They watched him with the godlike and superior impartiality with which spectators judge card games. An orderly elbowed his way through them and came up the steps of the rostrum with a tray of coffee cups. The coffee soon disappeared, and he went back to the kitchen for more. August drank his without tasting it. He watched the 2 coloured lights rushing towards each other. They represented a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. He knew that a mistake in the timing of Katze 1's turn could cause them to miss the contact. That wasn't an enjoyable thing for the commanding officer to do for an audience of subordinates. Skip, give me a bit of straight and level for a star shot. Kosher Cohen stood under the Perspex Astrodome, fixing the stars through a sextant. Kosher was one of the few RAF navigators who was skilled in its use. At the navigation school, he'd handled it better than his instructor. Where the devil did you learn how to handle one of these, son? My father's yacht, sir, and a bloody comedian to boot. Sit down. Next. There wasn't time for another shot, so he compared his readings with the G fix. 4 shots with a 4-mile-wide cocked hat to show their position. Not bad at all. Cohen looked at his plotting chart in the tiny circle of his desk light. To make good his track, he drew the wind speed and direction and calculated their ground speed from the remaining side of the triangle thus formed. 11 minutes to the Dutch coast, he said. No one answered. Lambert shifted his behind on the hard parachute pack. The heavy unpowered controls required a lot of physical strength to move them, and already he had an ache in his shoulder and the usual pain in his spine. He sat upright to stretch his back and rolled his shoulders. "We are within radar range," he warned the crew. "Keep your eyes peeled for fighters." Like all of the bomber stream's wireless operators, Jimmy Grimm, whose father had a radio shop in Highgate, was tuning his radio to the frequencies between 7050 and 7100 kilocycles, trying to find an enemy voice. Then he could transmit a signal on the same frequency to blot out the conversation between controller and fighter pilots. A microphone was fitted into an engine of each bomber, especially for this purpose. Suddenly, he heard August's voice. "Order. Start turning." "Now." "Turning," said Löwenherz. Jimmy Grimm was excited. "I found one of their controllers and a night fighter." August Bach's voice came over the headphones with the same clarity that Löwenherz heard it. "Order, steer, to 97 degrees, bombard," said August, "announcing enemy range 10 kilometers. The plane he's following is on our heading," said Cohen. "Every plane in the stream is on our heading," said Digby. He was full length in the nose trying to see the Dutch coast. "I wish I could understand German better," said Jimmy Grimm. "That's the trouble with being a radio ham. In peacetime I used to pick up all sorts of stations and only speak a few words of everything. While you types are sodding about, some poor bastard is going to get the chop," said Digby. "Why don't you jam him?" "Perhaps it's us he's after," said Binty from the mid-upper turret. "Can we steer on to 80 degrees just to be sure?" "Skipper," said Cohen. "You're the navigator," said Lambert, and put the plane into a shallow banking turn. "He's still a long way behind the bomber," said Cohen, "and the controller keeps telling him to lose height." "You are still well above him," August told Löwenherz. "Lose another 500 meters." Again Löwenherz touched the control column and the fighter dipped. Beside him, the observer had his field glasses on his lap. The bomber was too far away and the night too dark for there to be a chance of visual contact yet. Behind Löwenherz, facing rearwards, the radar operator was boxed in with so much equipment that he was scarcely able to move. His 3 radar screens that showed range, altitude position and lateral position were tucked under his right elbow, and to see them he had to cock his head on one side like a sparrow. It was useless to look at them yet, for the equipment wouldn't show the target until they were 3,000 meters away. "Order, hold it," warned August. Löwenherz throttled back. Flash Gordon was staring through the newly open part of his rear turret. God, it was cold, but he could see better than he had ever done before. If he bent forward, he could almost get his head outside the aircraft. When he rotated the turret, the slipstream passing across the barrels of the 4 Brownings made a gentle, screaming sound, like high wind through telephone wires. He kept the turret moving, making the gun muzzles describe little circles as he had practiced at gunnery school with pencils in the muzzles. A good gunner could write his name like that. It was a lonely position in the rear turret, especially when night fighters were about, for then chatter on the intercom was forbidden. Flash Gordon and Löwenherz were staring towards each other with all the concentration they could muster, but the night was too dark for either of them to see anything. Flash heard Cohen order a change of course and watched the clouds slide past the tail. August watched the red blip change direction on the Seaberg table. Willie marked it with the pencil. "He's turned to port," said August. "Order, steer, 15 degrees left." "He's very close now." "I think it is us," said Cohen. "He's told him to change direction." "Jam him," said Lambert urgently. Jimmy Grimm tuned his 1154 transmitter to the 1155 receiver, heard its whistle, sought the silent, dead space, and switched on the microphone that was fixed inside the engine. Lambert banked steeply to change course again. In the night fighter, they were silent. Löwenherz had turned as directed. Morozek, the observer, had his field glasses to his eyes and was scanning each side of the aircraft where the radar did not point. Suddenly Sax's radar tube lit up at the end of the range circle. A Tommy at extreme range. "We've got him," said Sax, trying hard to keep the excitement out of his voice. Suddenly jamming deafened them, so near were they to Jimmy Grimm's radio transmitter. "Just in time," said Löwenherz, and they tuned the noise to minimum. Löwenherz switched the gun's safety catches to fire, and a line of red lights appeared on the instrument panel. Suddenly the whole junkers hit a patch of turbulence. The plane dipped steeply like a horse refusing a fence. A wingtip fell, and Löwenherz had to use all his strength to correct the plane's heading. "The Tommy's slipstream," said Löwenherz, but the others knew what it was. The force of it showed how close they were behind the speeding bomber. "He's turning right," said Sax, as the blip on his screen started traveling along its baseline. "He's turning. Keep turning." He watched the tube. "Level out, but keep turning. Range still closing. Straighten out. Range still closing too fast. 1,200 meters." Löwenherz followed the turn until when heading almost due south, the bomber straightened out and Löwenherz did too. "Where do you want him?" asked Sax. "Slightly starboard. He's about 7 degrees starboard." "That's enough. Read off the range." "Under 1,000 meters, closing slowly." Löwenherz wanted to move on to the bomber as slowly as possible, for that would give him the maximum duration of gunfire. "Bring me in level with him. I'll lose height when we get a visual. It's still very dark. You'd do better to have him against that bright cirrus." "Very well. Bring me in a little below him. 900. Left a touch. We're coming in too quickly. Herr Oberleutnant. I can't see him. Still too fast. Damn, why is he throttling right back?" Löwenherz reduced his speed until Sax grunted. "That's in order. Herr Oberleutnant. Still can't see him. We're very close. 500 meters. Got him," said Löwenherz. And at the same time, Morozek also gave a yell. 8 yellow dots of exhaust flame pinpricked a horizon across the darkness. And because all primitive rituals go, especially those concerned with death, have their own vocabulary, Löwenherz reported his sighting to Bach with the words, "Kettle drums." "Kettle drums." "Lancaster bomber," said Morozek, whose task it was to identify the targets before an attack. "You beauty," said Löwenherz. Flash Gordon was a mild man, small in stature, humble in origin and quiet of voice, and yet within him was growing a hatred of Binty Jones that he wouldn't have thought possible. Hardly a day went by without a jibe or a word of sarcasm, and now most recent and hurtful of all was Binty's scorn of his turret modification. If Binty had publicly recognized what a fine idea it was, then the gunnery officer might have ordered the turrets of all squadron planes to be similarly altered. Who knows? It might have been called the Gordon panel. Invented by a gunner named Gordon Dirkit, people say he was one of the greatest gunnery experts the Air Force ever had. Although Flash Gordon never told real lies, he had come to realize that sometimes a white lie can be necessary for the sake of mankind's progress. If telling a lie was the only way of having an excellent modification incorporated into Warley Fen's aeroplanes, then a lie wouldn't stand in his way. "In 10 minutes I'll do it," he thought, but changed his mind. There would never come a quieter time than now. That fighter scare was over, and they were quite alone in the sky. "Fighter, fighter. Corkscrew port. Go," said Flash Gordon. Without bothering to use the sights, he opened fire into the blank darkness. Lambert. Obeying instinctively the command that any crew member was empowered to give, flung creaking door into a vertical bank and let it drop through the air like a slate. Binty Jones, not to be outdone by his colleague, also fired his guns. Curves of tracer hose-piped across the sky as door fell faster than its turrets could turn. "My God," said Löwenherz as the tracer came towards him. Instinctively he shied away, while Dawes' 8 exhaust flames tipped vertical and slid out of sight under his nose. The little .303 bullets that the Thomas fired were seldom fatal against the solidly built Junkers, but still Löwenherz found it impossible to fly through them. "He's seen us," said Mrozek. Löwenherz swore. He followed the bomber down, trying to bring the flame spots up past the windscreen again, but now that he was higher than the bomber, he no longer had the advantage of the moonlit clouds. Lambert was following the classic maneuver of the corkscrew and chanting its litany as he went, to warn the crew, diving port, climbing port, roll, climbing starboard, diving starboard, roll, diving port, climbing port. Many times Löwenherz had seen such an evasive pattern. 4 or 5 times he had been able to execute identical maneuvers in formation with his victim and kill him while they danced together. He could not do it this time. For a corkscrew can be executed in such a leisurely fashion that it occupies 10 miles of airspace. Some pilots corkscrewed like this the whole journey, or it can be the brutal wing-wrenching, back-breaking maneuver that Lambert now put into effect. "Lost contact," said Sachs. "My fault," said Löwenherz. The night fighter's Lee C-1 airborne radar projected only a narrow cone of signals straight ahead, between 60 and 30 degrees to be precise. Löwenherz waggled his aircraft through a horizon-searching series of maneuvers. It was no use. He switched on the radio transmitter. "Announcement," said Löwenherz. "Katze 1, contact lost." "Katze 1, said August, his voice still badly marred by the jamming. "Order, steer 200 degrees d'Orient." August looked at the plotting table and saw that the blip that was creaking door was at the extreme edge of his sector. "He has luck." "That Tommy," said August. "If he'd turned the other way, we'd still be able to go after him." "There are plenty more where he came from," said Willie. In creaking door, Lambert had stopped corkscrewing. His hands were trembling so that Battersby would not notice he kept a tight grip on the controls. Suddenly the pain in his back and shoulder, unnoticed during the time of danger, returned with new ferocity. "Give me a course for Nordwijk, Kosh," said Lambert. "6, skip," said Cohen. Always the perfect navigator. He had been keeping the calculation fresh while waiting for the question. "Now, do you believe in my clear vision panel?" Flash Gordon asked the world at large. He had waited long enough for a word of congratulation or thanks. "Bloody good show," said Lambert. "I don't believe you saw anything," accused Binty Jones. "A damn great night fighter. Man, in fact, I think I may have hit him." "Balls," said Binty. "There was nothing there." "Then why were you firing?" asked Flash. There was no reply. "The Gordon Clearview panel, I'm going to call it. Just an old-fashioned liar with old—" Binty began the 4th verse of the song. "For Christ's sake, belt up, everyone," said Lambert. Sanam's suite had lost headway by the wind error back at Lowestoft, and Daw had been turning and corkscrewing over the ocean so that by midnight, German time, while both Sweet and Lambert were 8 miles short of the coastline, Tommy Carter in Joe for King and Fleming in the Volkswagen had reached Nordwijk, turned, and were 4 miles along their final leg for the target. About midway between them, 2 miles off Nordwijk, Löwenherz was moving back over the sea. Twice he had passed within 100 yards of Joe for King. For a few seconds, his wingtip was only 20 feet from the tailplane of a Halifax, but none of the crews had spotted these near misses, and to them the sky seemed vast and empty. Noordwijk aan Zee is a holiday resort on the coast of Holland. In 1943, the sand was crisscrossed with barbed wire, and steel spears were hidden in the sea. The hotels had become convalescent homes and military offices, and the wide seafront that in peacetime was crowded with holidaymakers was guarded by armed sentries. The lighthouse stands on the modern esplanade, and now its shaded light was switched on while the convoy moved past. The flak cruiser Held was leading the line of ships, and it located the bomber stream as they passed overhead. Each time the Held fired, the sound rattled every window in Nordwijk, and flashes lit up the whole seafront. The red fire of one salvo burst uncomfortably close to Löwenhertz's Junkers, and he climbed away from the flashes. It was the second time within 12 hours that Admiral Pollack had fired at Löwenhertz, but there was, of course, no way in which either of them would ever know that. "How nice of them," said Lambert. "They've got the Nordwijk lighthouse switched on for us." He asked Cohen for a course that would take him well short of the nearby town of Leiden with its notorious flak concentrations, even while Lambert and Digby in the nose were looking at the pulsating glimmer of the lighthouse. The whole esplanade suddenly lit up as if the sun had selected that town for a private dawn. 2 Pathfinder Lancasters had dropped flares to mark it as the turning point for the bomber stream. The lighthouse keeper peered out of the window at the blinding yellow Christmas trees of flares that inched slowly downward, crackling loudly and sending up snakes of white smoke. Illuminated by the flares, the smoke looked yellow. So did all the hotels and the faces of the sentries and the Luftwaffe aircrew staring out of the windows of the convalescent home. "Kosh," said Lambert. "Turning point markers at Nordwijk." Cohen pulled aside the curtain that screened his chart table. The light from his desk was briefly reflected in Lambert's windscreen before Cohen switched it off. It took him a moment to adjust his eyes to the dark. Then he leaned across to the window and saw the strip of coastline with its hotels and lighthouse lit by the flares. "That would be about right," said Cohen, and stood staring for a moment before going back to his charts. Löwenhertz, 2 miles to the north, also saw the flares. "In control from Katze 1, he said. "Turning point markers going down on Nordwijk. I'll head towards them until you give me a contact." At Willy Reinecke quickly wiped the wax pencil marks off the frosted glass as the kitchen orderly returned with more coffee. The wide-eyed young man served Willy and August, and then gave one each to the blip operators who sat under the table. He gave one to the telephone man, too. Outside, the orderly had seen a big glow in the sky. "Big fires to the north of here," he confided. "Leiden's getting it, I should think." Scornfully, the telephonist said, "Nonsense. That's just the Thomists dropping their marker flares to help the bombers find the way. The raid hasn't begun yet. Junge." He took the hot coffee and put in 3 sugars. It was going to be a long night if they came back this way. Very, very high in the sky above Nordwijk, a fast RAF Mosquito also saw the flares. The 8.8 centimeter flak could not reach the Mosquitoes because they flew so high. The Würzburgs had difficulty tracking them because they were made of wood, and the night fighters had not been able to catch them because they were so fast. This one was flying to a house where he would turn south for 50 miles and, flying under electronic guidance would lay 4 red markers upon Krefeld for the heavy bombers to pound. That, at any rate, was the plan. Meanwhile, it was exactly 1 minute past 1 o'clock when the flares went down on Nordwijk. Within seconds, reports of them were being phoned to the Opera House at Dielen, where they were marked in on the giant screen. Sentries in coastal watchtowers saw them, and so did air raid volunteers on factory roofs. The control room of the flak cruiser Held gave their bearing, and the Hitler Jugend gunners at our house reported their glow. In the Flugwacht Commando at Duisburg, the experts waited to see whether the planes would really turn at Nordwijk. It was an RAF trick to drop TP markers. Having briefed their crews to ignore them, this had sometimes caused the Fluko to warn the wrong district, and workers lost sleep sitting in damp cellars cursing the Luftwaffe. Still worse, the defences and people in the real target were left unprepared. Within 2 minutes there were enough other reports to persuade them that the stream was turning. Warnzentral's commander needed only to nod to his attentive deputy. PAZs, pre-alert zones, became AZRs, alert zones, as the bombers moved eastwards. The country over which the bombers moved blacked out completely. Railways stopped, stations went dark, factory workers took shelter. AD 30 for the whole roar. Air danger 30. Cities, towns and villages, as far as Cologne and Dortmund, were told to prepare for an attack in 30 minutes. At the flak sites, cigarettes were doused and coffee abandoned as men came grumbling, laughing and yawning out of the rest huts, buttoning their greatcoats against the chilly night. The barrels were elevated. Searchlights tilted, radar warmed and shells fused. Civil defense workers, police, fire services and hospitals were warned too. Shelters were unlocked, and the Nazi Party organization through which bombed-out civilians were cared for began to prepare. Fires were lit under vats of soup, blankets were sorted, shrouds made ready, ration cards endorsed, and bundles of second-hand clothing untied. Altgarten was now in the PAZ. "Did you see the sunset this evening?" asked Gerda Pippert, of the man sitting on her left. She had gained confidence by now. No one had guessed that she was not the Frau Pippert on the invitation list, and nowadays everyone was far too concerned with his own life to inquire into hers. "Ah," said her companion, "we should have been out in Collar Meadow, you and me, holding hands and catching pneumonia on the damp grass." Gerda Pippert blushed. He was frightful, this bald-headed little man with whom she had sat through dinner, and yet everyone else took his jibes in good spirits, so she was reluctant to object, although, goodness knows, Collar Meadow behind the hospital and nurses' training centre had become truly notorious on these summer nights. There was a joke going around town. Whenever someone had a bruise or cut, they said they had fallen over a nurse while crossing Collar Meadow in the blackout. The architect's wife, who even on this warm evening had insisted upon sitting through dinner in her fur cape, leaned across and said, "I heard they were going to have caviar." "I've never had caviar," said Gerda Pippert. "It's horrible," said Gerd Bull. "I'll take smoked eel every time." "How lucky you are, to have a taste for the common things," said Frau Hinkelberg. She was watching her architect husband at the far end of the table as he talked with a red-headed young cousin of the burgomaster. Once before, she'd had trouble with her husband over a redhead. "There are certainly enough common things about," agreed Gerd Bull cheerfully. As he reached for a second helping of tart, he winked at Gerda and she smiled at him. He didn't care what he said to anyone, and she admired that in a man. She always had. She looked around the table at all the guests, especially the ladies. There was the burgomaster's mother. What a dignified lady, 86 years old, with a lace blouse, boned high under her chin, and freckled white hands glittering with rings. There was the burgomaster's wife, her white hair drawn back in the severe earphone style that was now considered patriotic. A handsome woman of great charm and kindness, neither of which virtues could truly be attributed to her husband. "And the lady with the diamond tiara?" asked Gerda Pippert. "Gräfin von Link, the astrologer?" "None other," said Gerd. "People say Reichsführer Himmler consults her. She says victory will come next year." "Yes, she does. She says that every year." Gerda Pippert scrutinized Gerd's face in alarm, and Frau Hinkelberg tutted her disapproval. All the waiters were busy attending to the curtains, so Gerd reached to the ice bucket and served both ladies with a little more French champagne. He noticed that the 1937 label saying "for export to England" had been overprinted with "Réservé pour la Wehrmacht." He wondered if that labelling department had already prepared similar ones for the Americans or even the Russians. To drown the thought, he served himself an extra measure. The windows of the Frenzelstuber's private room gave all the burgomaster's guests an extensive view of the town, which is why the waiters had waited so long before closing the curtains and putting on the lights. But once that was done, a different atmosphere came to the party. more intimate, and seemingly more private too. The guests, merry with the burgomaster's carefully chosen and generously supplied wine, settled into their chairs and made ready for the speeches and toasts that would occupy the rest of the evening. Some speechmakers already had their notes before them on the table. Gerd Boel timed his exit nicely. A second helping of Frenzel's apple tart marked the end of the evening as far as he was concerned. He knew the drill from now on. Coffee cups were standing by on the trolley, and even before the spoons were in the saucers, the first of the speechmakers would be on his hind legs, mouthing a diligently assembled collection of sycophantic and patriotic clichés. Each would bring lengthy, if unenthusiastic, applause. It was a damn shame about the cigars, blunt-ended Stumpen from Holland, that had long since disappeared from any sources that Gerd Boel knew, but even they didn't tempt him to stay. He had explained to the burgomaster that this evening he would have to leave early in case of air raid duties. "Duty comes first," the burgomaster had said. Many years ago he'd been complimented on his fine speaking voice, and he always pronounced his careful Hochdeutsch as though speaking to an imbecilic foreign child. Actually, Gerd Boel was going down to the railway station buffet for a game of scat with his Tino friends. He'd promised to be there before 11:30, and he whispered his excuses to the garrulous wife of the architect and to the simple old schoolteacher woman seated next to him. "Goodbye, Frau Pippert," said Gerd. "So nice to see you again, and I'm glad to see your foot is so much better." Frau Pippert smiled uneasily. So the real Frau Pippert had a bad foot. "Yes," she said tentatively. "It's much better now." She decided to embellish it a bit. "The toes give a stab of pain from time to time." "Well, we can't complain about that," said Gerd cheerfully. "After all, there are not many people these days who can grow a complete new leg after an amputation." Gerd smiled and kissed her hand. "Have a wonderful evening, Frau Pippert," he said. A grocer has to be most careful about confusing the bills for two ladies of the same name. But luckily there are no other grocers here this evening. Oberwachtmeister Müller was on his feet as soon as the coffee appeared, but by fast footwork Gerd just made it to the door. Müller pulled at the skirt of his blue uniform jacket and cleared his throat nervously. It was an honor to speak first, and yet it was difficult too. The waiters were still serving the coffee, and he noticed more than one guest looking enviously at that fellow Boel as he practically ran to the door. Someone rapped upon the table with a spoon, and then, as he began to speak, they gave him their undivided attention. The police chief related the burgomaster's achievements and Altgarten's role as a war-winning and law-abiding part of the Third Reich. If it was a story that also reflected the police chief's successes, then that was exactly as it should be. Other officials added their praise. The Gasmeister and the Kreisleiter gave brief speeches. Some speakers saw this as an occasion upon which they could once again relate Germany's progress from the demoralized nation that emerged defeated from the First World War to the mighty, fear-inspiring master of Europe in 1943. Schott, the electricity chief, had known the burgomaster for the greater part of this time. In 1933 they had worked side by side at a bench in one of the factories that were secretly rearming the newly planned Wehrmacht. Schott spoke of those times. It was not a period of his life about which the burgomaster cared to be reminded. An old man in the paint shed stole one piece of perambulator each day. When he had all the parts, he tried to reassemble one in his living room. "Funny thing," he told me, "every time I try it, I end up with a machine gun." There was laughter and applause, and even the burgomaster smiled primly. Most of the men were in uniform. A stuttering party official from Berlin had come in an SA uniform complete with ceremonial dagger, commemorative armband, Horst Wessel, and a display of medals and ribbons. He presented an engraved plaque to mark the burgomaster's service on the committee of a local Adolf Hitler school. Obersturmführer Berger, senior full-time SS official of Altgarten, then stood up. He straightened the knot of his black tie and flicked at his sleeve as if to remove a piece of lint from his grey tunic. Satisfied with his appearance, Berger smiled upon his neighbours. He announced the burgomaster's promotion to honorary SS Obersturmführer and made a witty speech describing the lengths to which the Allgemeine Office had gone to arrange that the promotion be announced on this, the burgomaster's birthday. He also made a little joke that the burgomaster had caught up with his own rank, and he thought he should now turn the tables upon him by becoming honorary burgomaster. It wasn't much of a joke, but there were so few jokes made that evening that the guests took that opportunity of having a side-splitting laugh and a cough. The evening sped past, thanks in some measure to the way in which Frenzel's waiters enthusiastically complied with the burgomaster's order to keep the champagne coming until everyone has had enough, or I tell you otherwise. The old room smelled of roast duckling, schnapps, candles and good cigars, smells that went deep into the oak panelling and joined memories of other dinners in other times. The rehearsed speeches came to an end at midnight, when the tiniest young Volkboy in Altgarten presented the burgomaster with a huge bunch of flowers on behalf of all of the Nazi youth organizations in the district. There were still some impromptu addresses and the old songs. "A memorable evening," said Berger, who had taken off his SS jacket and was leading a chorus in a voice as powerful as it was discordant. SS Standartenführer Wirth, CO of the SS unit at the Wald Hotel, smiled indulgently at Berger as he sang the old party songs. He joined him in a chorus of one that he remembered from his days as an ensign, although the old man's voice was scarcely audible. At 20-1, he declared that it was his bedtime and got to his feet. He was like an overbred borzoi dog, his limbs thin and spindly, and his face the same, with sad grey eyes that looked round anxiously as though fearing unprovoked attack. The old SS officer moved slowly, prodding the floor with his stick before committing his weight to it. He gave a nod to the other guests and edged through the door. Behind him, Dieter Witting, a burly NCO, was ready to support an elbow or pull a chair for him or signal a person from his path in a courteous and unobtrusive way that would not mark Wirth as the desperately sick man that he was. The car was close to the entrance and the driver wrapped blankets across his commander's knees before closing the door with a considerate click. Wirth sank back into the leather seat and closed his eyes to meet the pain. His missing left hand still tormented him more than did his injured knees or feet. It was a few minutes after 1 when a messenger arrived from the rat house and whispered in the burgomaster's ear, "Until that young fellow arrived with his steel helmet, heavy-duty gloves and official overalls, it had been perfectly possible to forget that there was a war on." "Can I have your attention?" said the burgomaster, and the whole room was alert. The waiters stood at attention, the way they did each morning when Herr Frenzel inspected their hands and nails. "I have official notification that there is a heavy force of RAF planes in the air tonight. Our Fluko in Duisburg has given us the preliminary warning. They predict that the Ruhr will be attacked. My guests will no doubt wish to answer the call of duty at the earliest possible moment. I will therefore bid everyone good night. Heil Hitler!" "Heil Hitler!" repeated the guests soberly. The burgomaster kissed his wife and mother and bowed to his guests. The first ones to leave saw searchlights to the northwest. Soon after that, the early warning sounded. Altgarten railway station was noted more for the liveliness of its buffet than for the liveliness of its train schedules. The Bahnhofecke had become a favorite hangout for policemen from the Rathaus across Bismarckplatz and for Ternau engineers, as well as the brewery manager and his foreman and, of course, the railway people who were there all the time. It was smoky and noisy all day every day, and it smelled of thin beer, cheap tobacco and synthetic sausage. Sometimes it didn't close until 3 a.m., even though the 1 o'clock train was the last one. Many times, when the main line was bombed, troop trains had been shunted into Altgarten, and the two old ladies who ran the Bahnhofecke had served beer, coffee and sandwiches until the supplies were exhausted. The buffet was furnished like a Victorian parlour. There were dozens of plants, glass-fronted cases full of polished glasses, a bust of Beethoven and a drawing of Wagner, a coloured reproduction of the Führer, and an old piano. On the top shelf of the bar there were school caps donated by high school students when they went off to the war. It had become a ritual. And now there were 28 dusty caps untouched since the day they were flung there. On that same top shelf there were 4 ancient empty Scotch whisky bottles. Never a week passed without some joker ordering a white horse or a black and white, but still old Frau Klein was able to smile as if the joke was new. The 3 tables near the piano were the best ones. From the counter, one of the 2 old ladies could lean over with bread, beer, sausage and potatoes. But on a crowded evening, customers near the door could shout all evening and still not be served. The 3 best tables were marked with Stammtisch flags, so that only regulars would dare to sit there. This evening, the centre one was taken by a group of men playing skat for small money stakes, and a little crowd had collected to watch the card players, Gerd Burl and his 2 Tino friends. Fuchs Überall was talking. His Tino jacket was hung upon his chair. The 2 stars on its collar patch showed him to be a Zugwachtmeister, which is a grand title for an NCO. His army braces supported ill-fitting grey trousers that almost covered his chest. He had a strong Saxon accent. It seemed especially comical here, where the local people spoke a high-speed dialect like Dutch. But no one smiled. It would be foolhardy to annoy this amiable giant. "You'll never get them bowling here in Altgarten," said Fuchs. "It's too near the Dutch border for the Tommies to risk it. If you mean bombing, say bombing. I hate these slang words," said Peter Reuter, a Tino officer. He asked for another card. That rumour was resurrected every now and again. It's a comforting thought. They are forbidden under pain of execution to bomb targets within 20 kilometres of any frontier of their ex-allies, said Fuchs Überall. He put emphasis on the word bomb. "How do you know that?" asked Peter Reuter. "I hear the Americans and British never execute their soldiers. We are 11 kilometres from the Dutch border here. Do you know of any bombs dropping as close as that to the border?" "Yes," said Gerd. He won the trick and piled the cards in front of him. I know about the plane that jettisoned its bombs on Frau Kirsten's place. That doesn't count." "You'd better explain that to Frau Kirsten," said Gerd. Some of the men laughed. And "Play on," said Bodo. Fuchs was a rumour-monger. "She's too busy learning French to let me prove anything to her," said Fuchs, and there was a louder laugh. The 1 o'clock train was almost due when Jürgen Löwe, one of the Hitler Youth bicycle messengers, came into the Ecke. He wouldn't sit down because he had an urgent message for Andy Niels and had been unable to find him. The HJ messenger said, "The Ruhr is going to get pasted tonight, over 700 Terraflieger." The Fluko message said, one of the men playing cards said, "That will be the 2nd heavy raid in a week." 2 brewery workers were playing chess in the corner. They had their French army helmets and gloves ready and were wearing their civil defence overalls. "Lie in tomorrow morning," said one of them, for if the alarm went at night, they were paid a 2 Reichsmark bonus and allowed 2 hours off in the morning. "Loser of this game goes back to phone the rat house."
"Me? Suits me," said the second one, and he brought his bishop to threaten the king's knight. Herr Hollander, the marriage registrar, was one of the local Blockwarte. He swallowed the last of his beer and hurriedly got to his feet when he heard that a raid was imminent. It was his job to open the shelter and collect front door keys from local residents in case of firebombs.
He also must make sure that old deaf Frau Kleitman was properly awakened when the alarm sounded. Not all the people from his block would go down into the shelter, in spite of the regulations. Most of them worked in the brewery, and no one who had to clock on at 7:15 wanted to interrupt his sleep and go into the cold cellar. Block-Watt Hollander slipped out quietly. The 1 o'clock train came in exactly on time with a whistle, a groan, and a hissing of steam. 6 Tenno engineers who were going on leave left the Ecke to derisory cheers. The doors had hardly stopped swinging when one of the Tenno men put his head back round it. "Come and look at the Tommy flares going down, somewhere near Neukirchen, I'd guess." The words were hardly out of his mouth when the public warning began. The warbling notes echoed eerily across the town. Even then, not everyone left the Ecke. The public warning was only a preliminary caution for people in the street or a long way from shelter. And even if the more serious general warning sounded, it was purely academic out here in Altgarten. The bombs were destined for one of the big cities of the Ruhr. Gerd Boll still had his playing cards in his hand when he went out to look at the flares. They were a long way away. Sputtering little pinpoints of intense light like that of the old-fashioned acetylene cycle lamps. Gerd decided it was time for him to report with his van to the Rathaus control room. Once the Fluko let them know where the attack was being centered, he would head into the bombed town to help. That was the advantage of being single, thought Gerd. He'd never be able to do such a thing if he had a wife and children to look after. That's what led him to think of Hansel and the girl. If the attack was going to be a heavy one, over 700, the messenger had said, then perhaps he had better call in at August's place and make sure the child and the girl took shelter tonight. They'd object, of course, but he would insist upon it. He sat down again and took a last look at his cards. Then he raised his eyebrows to ask what Reuter thought would happen. Bodo Reuter played a famous game of scat. He'd played it when as a 15-year-old he'd falsified his age to go to the First War. He'd played it in the Merchant Navy, and now after many evenings in the Bahnhofecke playing Gerd Boll and old Fuchs for Pfennig bets, he'd almost regained his former skill. After a few glasses of Gerd's homemade schnapps, he'd tell stories. Around the Cape in a floating dock, the Grand Banks in a Spanish trawler, the trenches in the winter of 1917, Paris in the summer of 1940, brawls in Boston, brothels in Shanghai. Oberzug Führer Reuter had done it all. And, as he said, some of it twice. He was from Hamburg. A quick-spoken man, thin, tall, with light blue eyes deeply set into their sockets. Drawn face, high cheekbones and a big forehead with receding, soft, fair hair. He looked more like an art critic than a pioneer officer. Most of Altgarten's Tenno battalion were like Fuchs. Brawny fellows with a noisy sense of humour. Some of the regulars at the Ecke found it hard to believe that this quiet-spoken man had done the things of which he told, but he had a chest full of medals to prove it, and, as he had once told a crowd of angry Bolsheviks, his hands told the story of his life. Knobbly red, angry hands they now were, shiny with scar tissue and crisscrossed with corns from a windjammer's lines. Bodo threw his hand of cards upon the table to indicate that the game could not continue. Gerd lined up the edges of his cards with a neurotic care, and Fuchs Ueberall sadly assembled the whole pack together and put it into its box. For an hour, Fuchs had become a civilian again, but now that Altgarten had come under attack, he was jerked back into the world of harsh, military reality. "Take my grocery van," Gerd told Bodo. "I will borrow a bicycle and be with you before you are ordered out." There was no time for the courtesy of argument. Bodo caught the keys that were thrown to him and, nodding to the other men in the bar, hurried out. Fuchs sat in the front seat alongside his officer, and a few minutes later it was Fuchs who shouted in time for them to avoid driving into a big crater near the railway crossing. Gerd borrowed a woman's bicycle from Frau Klein behind the bar. The tiny, slotted blue streetlights had been extinguished, but the luminous paint on the trees and lampposts helped him find his way through the darkened town. As he passed the Nazi Party HQ, he popped in to tell them there was a big raid tonight, but one glance told him that he needn't have bothered. The NSV kitchens were bustling with voluntary workers in aprons and party officials in their fine uniforms. Shrewdly, it was a matter of policy, that compensation. Clothing, soup kitchens, and emergency aid for the homeless were all provided by Nazi Party workers. Gerd picked his way past mountains of potatoes. The raw smell of the freshly peeled ones was strong. Gerd hated that smell. There were blue, fan-tailed gas flames under the soup vats, and more potatoes were being tipped into the peeling machines. "Some coffee, Herr Böll?" said Frau Grundl. "I mustn't interrupt the good work," said Böll. The woman smiled. Many years ago they had held hands under the trees, and on summer evenings like this had walked along the stream as far as the Kirsten windmill, long since broken and demolished. Now she was nearly 50, widowed with 3 grown-up daughters and a soldier son. She ran her baker's shop and still volunteered long hours for the Frauenschaft. Frau Grundl reached for a chipped enamel mug from the shelf of mugs that stood ready by the stove. She poured the hot, dark coffee and passed it to him. "For the Hilfszug?" asked Gerd Böll. "That's it," said the woman. "The lorries are waiting. It's strange to think that within 3 hours, poor bombed-out people in the Ruhr will be drinking our good hot potato soup." She smoothed the starched white apron of her uniform. "We've a lot to thank God for. God and the Führer." "Gerd," said the woman. "There are flares dropping to the north," said Gerd. "And searchlights." "You are the third one to tell us," said Frau Grundl. "But there's no need to be alarmed about the Terrorflieger. Our brave boys will be in the air after them." "I must be getting along," said Gerd Böll. He swallowed his coffee and pursed his lips at the bitter aftertaste. Frau Grundl noticed his grimace. "You've nothing to worry about. Our anti-aircraft defences in the Ruhr are the most formidable in the world." "Goodbye, Frau Grundl," said Gerd. She turned away and switched on the peeling machine, which made a noise like thunder. Anna Luisa was brushing her hair carefully, 300 times as she did every night, when she heard the voice of little Hansel from the next room. "Fräulein! Fräulein! Yes, Hansel! But you must get back into bed." He had pulled back the curtains. "The pretty lights, Fräulein. Such pretty lights, like Christmas trees in the sky." Anna Luisa went to the window. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like Christmas trees. What, Hansel? Is Daddy doing it?" "No, Liebchen." The coloured lights were close, very close. She picked him up. "You're a weight, Hansel. Soon you will be too heavy for me to lift. When I am a man, I will lift you." "Fräulein, that will be splendid," said Anna Luisa, and kissed the boy. When the knock came at the door, she went to it, still carrying Hansel. "Herr Böll." "Is something wrong?" "Good. You are dressed." "Why?" "I want you to take shelter this night." "Shelter?" "Next door with Herr Voss. Last month he told August that he wanted you and the child to shelter there if the air raids came. His shelter is reinforced and has fans for air. Suffocation is the great danger. You see, tonight? The flares are dropping already. They are target markers. You must hurry, but they will not bomb Altgarten, but please hurry. I must get my shoes and a coat for Hansel." "I can't wait, Fräulein," said Gerd. "Hurry," and knock loudly on Herr Voss's door. "I know he's in because his blackout always has chinks in it, but he plays the gramophone and he may not hear you. It was kind of you, Herr Böll." "I promised August," said Gerd coldly. He swung his leg over the saddle of Frau Klein's bicycle and pedaled away towards the Tenno camp. When the first bombs fell, it was a sound new to Anna Luisa, a slippery, shuffling half-whistle, like a heavy parcel sliding down a metal chute. Each ended with a bang, not the sort of bang that a firecracker or a pistol makes. This was as different from those bangs as a tuba is from a piccolo. These were big, brassy bangs that slapped ears, shook the ground underfoot, and kicked urgently at the windows. "We must hurry, my darling Hansel." The lights of the final Lancaster disappeared over the hedge of Warley Fen airfield. The sound of that last one became fainter until it too was gone. For a few minutes there always remained an unnatural quiet that made even insensitive people speak in whispers. The group captain was not an insensitive person. He stopped signing papers and turned out the desk lamp before drawing the blackout curtains and opening the window. A cold wind made the papers on his desk flap noisily. The flare path was switched off, and except for the shielded lights on the corners of each building and a careless blackout in the operations block, the night was dark and still. It was always the same for him when the aeroplanes had gone. The group captain felt remote. He had a secret fear that one night none of them would come back, and he would sit alone on the airfield forever after. This was the 12th raid this month. It was too many. His men were tired, and so was he. He'd pulled every string he knew to be used as a Pathfinder squadron, but if he faced the truth, they weren't up to it. They were very ordinary airmen, and he was an unexceptional commander. He wished he could manage on 4 hours sleep a night, like so many of the young ones could, but missing sleep made him tired, forgetful and easily irritated. In spite of that, he always waited until the planes returned. It would be unthinkable to go back to the house and try to sleep. He hated the place. It was far too large and empty for one man. Warley's previous station commander had a wife and 3 children, and so much furniture that he'd been pleased to leave half of it behind when he'd heard that Jarman had no furniture of his own to bring. He wished Helen had lived long enough to see him get his scrambled egg and a station of his own. Some of his comrades and their wives felt sorry for him in that there had been no children. Laurie and Daphne had even said so. That was because they had no idea of the relationship between a commander and his men on a proper combat station, an operational station. How often they had dreamed of it and joked of it when he was a young acting flight lieutenant in the tiny peacetime Air Force. Then it had seemed that promotion would never come. "Roll on, death. Promotion is too slow," they used to joke in the mess. Now, my God, it was sometimes too fast. They had kids of air commodores throwing their weight about. Kids. As his eyes became accustomed to the darkness, he could see as far as B-flight dispersal. In the tin huts, where men would keep vigil through the cold night, tiny, temperamental stoves were being coaxed into flame. The group captain sniffed the wood smoke and remembered his 7 days in the front line in the spring of 1917. It was his whole leave. Those brave gods had thought him crazy, but they had no idea what it did to a young infantry officer to incarcerate him in a supply depot for the entire war. And at a time when at the front the average life of a subaltern was 3 weeks. His air crews were even more stringently selected than Haig's young officers, and yet in this month alone he'd lost 3 crews on their first trip. One crew had been here only 8 days. They had the courage of 1,000 lions, and no one would be allowed to mar the honor he felt at being in the front line with them. He sniffed loudly, closed the blackout curtains, and turned on the desk light again. The adjutant had left a pile of papers for signing, and he continued through them mechanically without reading the contents. It was like being the mayor of a little town. Nowadays he scarcely saw his aeroplanes. Again he picked up the note from Laurie at Besteridge. Dear Jar, what price Saturday now? Still no matter, I never said. Sports results are the acid test of skilled command, but you might be able to convert me to your point of view over a pint. Laurie. Attached to the hastily scrawled note, there was a newspaper clipping showing a famous cricketer in Air Force uniform with a Wellington bomber behind him and Laurie grinning alongside. The caption said that the batsman was now knocking bombs into German boundaries and was proud to be a member of the finest team of all, the RAF. Group Captain Jarman grunted. He'd never regretted anything more than the much-quoted remark he'd made after his cricket side had won the cup, but that was years before the war, when he was a young kid, commanding a small unit for the first time. It was only since Laurie had got this damned professional posted there that he'd suddenly taken an interest in cricket and started to borrow good players from all over the command. The AOC loved it. Of course. He and Laurie were as thick as thieves lately. Laurie had a devastating memory for indiscretions. Not his own, of course, but his rivals'. God knows what else he'd be saying in the mess on Saturday after they'd wiped the floor with Warley's keen but amateurish 11. Sweet had taken over as captain this season and had done a pretty good job with them. Except that this slow bowler, he looked down at his notebook, Lambert hadn't even put in an appearance for the last few games. The group captain filled his pipe carefully and lit it. There was a knock at the door and his clerk came in. "Corporal Taylor," she announced. She was just going off duty. "Hello, Corporal Taylor, sir. That's all right. Stand at ease. I don't think we've met before." He smiled. "But you've probably seen me about. You're in safety equipment, aren't you?" "Yes, sir. And now you are probably wondering why I sent for you." Corporal Taylor said nothing. "Sit down." "Corporal, as perhaps you know, we have a tradition in the RAF that on certain occasions officers and men talk what we call man to man. You probably know what I mean by that." Corporal Taylor still didn't speak. "It means that what we say to each other is informal. It means that you no longer have to weigh each word you say in case it might be what we call conduct to the prejudice of good order." He smiled paternally. "At times I've had fellows cut up frightfully rough when I've let them do that. Of course they've regretted it afterwards. I've made sure of that. But meanwhile I've been able to get to the bottom of something that's troubled them." "Smoke." "Corporal?" "No, thank you, sir. Now, how long have you been married to Flight Sergeant Lambert?" 3 months, sir." "Are you happy here, Corporal?" "Why aren't you happy there, my girl? What's so different about that aerodrome?" The group captain was so like her father. How could anyone describe it? Low-power bulbs at dead of night, iron beds, dirty linen, damp walls, and a door banging desolately. Behind it, some bereaved girl is taking an unendurably hot bath and drinking gin. "It's the war, Dad. I'm near to my husband." "Exactly. And meanwhile you've continued to use your single name for WAF records." "Yes, sir. I've been meaning to do something about it, but Section Officer Holroyd hasn't chased you up about it, and you're frightened that you'll be posted elsewhere if records here." "Yes, sir. Well, I've spoken to Miss Holroyd about you, and she tells me you're a conscientious worker, and she feels that on an operational station efficiency is the main thing." "Yes, sir. Yes, there's nothing more important than efficiency in this day and age. There's nothing more important than killing Huns. The RAF has no Colonel Blimps. It's a young service with young ideas, and it's not hidebound by rules and regulations. But there must be a matter of give and take. You know what I mean? Perhaps I will have a cigarette, sir." "Here we are. Matches on the desk. But give and take means that the Air Force expects people to have a similar goodwill in return. Mrs. Lambert, and that's what I want to talk to you about." "Yes, sir," said Ruth. "Your husband, Mrs. Lambert, is one of my most experienced captains. There are not many people on this station who were flying in 1937. Myself, of course, Wing Commander Monroe." The group captain felt that it was not a good line to pursue. "Anyway, when we've got a chap, a regular RAF aircrew bod, painting communist slogans across his aircraft. What will people think, eh? Communist slogans? Communist slogans? Mrs. Lambert? Joe Stalin? For king? You would call that a communist slogan, I take it? I would call it a joke. Sir, when people say that, they don't intend it to be taken literally. I mean, everyone is saying it. I've even heard it on the wireless. And that's exactly what we've got to be careful about. But that's not painted on my husband's aircraft. That's painted on Sergeant Carter's L for love. Allow me to know my own aeroplanes, Mrs. Lambert. You'll have to allow me that. He smiled, pitying her feminine limitations. Is that what you wanted me for, sir? No, it isn't, Corporal. I've sent for you to see if we can't get to the bottom of what's troubling your husband, Mrs. Lambert. He seems determined to challenge authority. And on this aerodrome, he smiled, well, I'm authority. Challenged you, sir? He leaned back in his chair, not sure of how to continue. When he began to speak again, it was with a new tone of voice, as though he had decided to reveal everything to her in a sudden attempt at reason. As you might know, Mrs. Lambert, I'm a committee man. Can't help it. Always have been, always will be. You get a reputation for helping with one set of chaps, and each of them will be off trying to get you on some other committee. But if there's one darned committee I'm pleased to be on, it's the cricket committee. It was my idea to appeal to the public for used cricket gear. Last year we staged parades. We flew a Lancaster over Peterborough, dropping leaflets about it, and had collections at the local cinemas whenever there was a flying film running. Got a trainload of cricket gear too. Well, that's good stuff. Mrs. Lambert keeps the chaps fit and amused. Cricket's a little like flying in combat, I always say. Long leisurely time in the pavilion, followed by brief moments when a chap faces some fast bowling. Damned like cricket, saving your presence, Mrs. Lambert. Understand? I don't think I do, said the cricket match on Saturday. RAF Warley Fen versus RAF Little Besteridge. I want Warley to win, Mrs. Lambert. That's natural enough, isn't it? Ruth smiled. It seemed so childish to go to all this trouble about a game. And you want my husband in the team? Well, of course, we all know he's the finest slow bowler in the group. With him we'll knock spots off them, but without him we've got no bowler worth the name. And this match is special? I mean, you haven't minded that he hasn't played much recently. Trust you to see right through me, Mrs. Lambert. As my mother once said, there's not a woman in the world who can't see right through me. Yes. The station commander at Little Besteridge is a chap I've known for years. He once played for 3 Group. If his dotty little maintenance unit at Besteridge beats us, he's going to make life hell for me on every committee meeting afterwards. He laughed and puffed at his pipe. You flatter me by suggesting that I can influence my husband, sir. And even if I could, I'm not sure that it would be wise.
Come, Mrs. Lambert. I'm not that naive, and neither are you. Give and take and give. That's the Air Force. You are living unofficially with your husband in the village when it's strictly against regulations, but your section officer and I don't want to be unreasonable. Ruth looked round the room as if seeking a way of escape. It was dark and inhospitable, and the air was charged with the herbal scent of the CO's tobacco. Over his desk lamp there was a flypaper, its gum shiny in the yellow glare. There were a dozen flies on it, and not all of them were dead. She knew she'd not been brought here to be consulted or even commanded. Nor did his intimate confessions of frailty convince her that he was anything but devious. She had been brought to bear witness that the CO was a man of infinite compassion and wisdom, a man devoid of personal ambition or prejudice, reluctant to see her husband punished for his intractable behavior. Ruth's father was like this, She remembered the way in which he'd humiliated her very first boyfriend, and afterwards pretended to be unaware of having done so. Ruth put one of her fingernails into the back of her hand until it almost bled. She wanted to be oblivious of everything except that little pain,
and she knew that if she were stoical about it, this frightening old man and his clever questions would disappear. When she looked up, he had not disappeared. "I don't know what you want of me," she said. She hoped he would reply, "Nothing. All I'm asking of you, Corporal, is to convey an unofficial message to your husband." He tapped his pipe into the ashtray. "I'm even thinking of taking him off flying duties." He watched Ruth during this slow and studied declaration, but he saw no change in her calm face. He was growing impatient of this foolish girl. A loyal wife would have immediately perceived the trouble that was in store for her husband. Her silliness was almost funny, and he permitted himself a trace of a smile. "You know what being taken off flying duties will involve, Mrs. Lambert." Ruth had been frightened that the group captain would see her hands trembling. So nervous was she, but his smile changed all that. It was the brief smile that some men kept ready for women, babies and respectful beggars, both patronizing and complacent. It triggered in her a righteous wrath. She tried to keep her voice low and calm as she replied, but the anger in her voice could not be concealed. "I know what it will involve, sir. That's the ultimate punishment in the Air Force, but it doesn't frighten me. How do you think I feel when I watch his plane take off at night? I'm lying awake full of sleeping pills that have no effect, waiting for a ring at the bell instead of the sound of his key in the lock. When they are diverted because of bad weather, it's worse. I stay near a phone all the time, waiting in case one of the girls from flying control might have heard something about the casualties. Take him off flying, if that's your decision, and then I'll have a husband who will live to see the war over." He pretended to concern himself with the papers on his desk. "I don't think you understand the disgrace that will go with him being grounded." "Have you?" She was determined not to raise her voice again. "Disgrace is only for men. Save talk of that for your schools and your clubs and your old comrades' dinners. Save talk of disgrace until you lose your cricket match, or for the next hesitant hero." He looked up. "Is that the way you will bring up your children, Mrs. Lambert? Without pride and without honor?" He said it as though he thought it most likely. Ask the widows of your dead air crews how they explain honor to their fatherless children, or to the rent collector. She twisted her wedding ring nervously and looked into the old man's eyes to see what effect her words were having. Like her father, he refused to reveal his discomposure even when, as now, she was promising to stop. "Oh well," she would continue. "If you really want to know what I mean by disgrace, it's to hear you talking about killing Huns as though it was a manly duel instead of blowing people and their homes to pieces. How could this old man ever understand?" she thought. "He has no wife, no children, no home. Just make sure your husband knows what's involved, Corporal." "Don't worry, sir." "Certain. Everyone on this station knows what's involved. We are all playing in your cricket match, aren't we? I wonder what your team will score over Krefeld tonight. And I wonder if my husband will be run out." The group captain said, "I think that will be all. Corporal, we shall be rectifying your present position vis-à-vis your marriage."
D. You can decide between making my husband very unhappy or me very unhappy. But one of us will be quite content. You are dismissed. Corporal. She stood up slowly and gave a salute of insolent perfection. Level with her eyes, a fly buzzed frantically but could not escape from the sticky paper. One had these hysterical women to deal with, and yet there was a limit to the disciplinary action possible. If an airman had even thought those things, he would have stripped him of his rank and put him into the glasshouse. But these women couldn't be treated like that. They were just uniformed civilians, really, and in any case they'd always think of some womanly ailment to excuse themselves, or else they'd go off and get themselves pregnant.
What's the use? He'd been a damned fool to speak to her in these circumstances, especially at night. A groupie in Coastal had reprimanded a WAF sergeant for losing some stores, whereupon she'd cried her eyes out and practically yelled rape. It had finished up with the groupie apologizing. When she'd gone, he rang the buzzer on his desk. "In the morning I shall want to speak to Section Officer Holroyd." "Shall I pencil in the subject?" said his clerk. "No, I shan't forget what I'm going to talk to her about." He could, of course, be elsewhere when Laurie brought his damned cricket team here on Saturday. It was damned disgraceful, that hysterical girl going on like that at the very moment when his lads were risking their brave young bodies. Levata labi superioris alaeque nasi, for no reason at all, Pilot Officer Fleming, at the controls of the Volkswagen, intoned the words like grace. He had in fact once said it as grace in the officers' mess, and had got by unchallenged, but he'd taken care not to do it when the medical officer was at table. "What's that, sir?" said Bertie the flight engineer, who thought it might be a technical matter he'd neglected. Fleming closed his eyes and tilted his head. "It's the longest name of any muscle in the human body." "What's the name of the shortest one?" said the mid-upper gunner, and was promptly answered insultingly, accusingly, and unscientifically by the wireless operator. "Okay, chaps," said Fleming, "let's have a bit of hush." 4 of the Leiden searchlights had been on for some time, but now another 6 were switched on. "Look at that," said Fleming. "Searchlights," said the flight engineer. In every group of lights, there was one that remained vertical. That one was controlled by a Würzburg radar. It was called the master searchlight. "I'm going to steer a bit to the north, Mac," Fleming told his navigator. "No sense in heading straight towards that muck." "Don't let's even head for the fringe of it," said the flight engineer. Fleming laughed. Perhaps the boy wasn't such an idiot after all. It was a bad system. Training an engineer apart from the crew, Fleming had known the rest of them for weeks, but he'd flown only a few hours with this child. His assistant pilot. Fleming wondered if the boy could handle the controls sufficiently well for him to go back to the lavatory. Next trip he would take that tin can he'd been offered and be grateful for it. Was it fear that did it? He'd noticed that the engineer and the bomb aimer had already been back there. It was easy for them, but he was strapped into the pilot's seat and getting out of it was a struggle. Fear should tighten the rectum and bladder, not loosen them, or so his medical training told him. In the briefing room he had watched his fellow men grow pale as fear diverted their newly thinned blood from the skin and the viscera to the brain. That's why so many had been unable to eat their supper. He'd felt his own heart begin to beat faster as his blood, now red corpuscle-dominated, sugar-rich and laden with adrenaline, rose in pressure. He handled the heavy controls with newly found strength and knew that fear had supplied blood to his muscles and his liver had released carbohydrate into his veins. His lungs benefited too, taking more oxygen in breaths that were both deeper and faster. The first sight of the searchlights had provided him with further physiological evidence of his fear. Loss of peristalsis and gastric juice had turned his supper into a hard knot and his saliva had gone, so that his tongue was rough against his mouth. Lastly, his scrotum had constricted tight against his belly. Resulting from these changes, Fleming believed he could detect a rise in body temperature as a result of the increased basal metabolic rate. To confirm his theory, a trickle of sweat rolled down his spine. His father, a truly dedicated physician, would be interested to hear of these observations. "Keep this course." "Skip," said the navigator. "We'll turn 5 miles inland instead of over Nordwijk. That should keep us well clear of Leiden." "Okie dokie," said Fleming, and for the first time felt truly like a skipper. Robin, fellow officer and bomb aimer, had been sitting at the navigator's table, filling in his log. He collected up his parachute, target map, log and thermos flask, disconnected his oxygen supply and came forward. He pushed the flight engineer gently to one side and, waving a greeting to Fleming at the controls, bent double to put his foot downwards until it reached the step formed by the glycol tank. Carefully he ducked his head under the traversing ring of the front gun turret with its twin Browning guns. This was his world. It was quieter here. He spread the map out and lay full length, with his belly on the exit hatch and his head in the clear view bowl that formed the nose of the aeroplane. Outside, the night was growing lighter. The moon was coming out. He looked round with interest, but not surprise. He had always known it would be like this. To the right, one of the searchlight beams was shorter than the others, and instead of tapering its beam, ended in a blunt hammerhead. "Look," said Robin, "they've got someone in the searchlights." "Poor swine," said Fleming, as he watched more searchlights affix their beams to the aeroplane. The trapped plane was tilting and twisting like a tormented animal. But although it broke clear of some of the beams, always at least one of them hung on to it. The flak had started now. Some of the bursts were so close to it that the smoke obscured their view for a second or two, but still the plane flew on. "We have him on our set now," said Löwenherz. "Where do you want him?" "Just starboard and level. Let me put him a trifle high, Herr Oberleutnant." "Very well. We're closing too fast again." In the searchlights, everything was white. Two more had him now, and they were fixing him to the sky like gleaming hatpins, holding a fluttering white moth in a black velvet box. There was a brief flicker under the plane, and it shivered slightly. "He's hit. It's Beebeer, the navigation leader, the immortal Lud." The navigator couldn't see. "Are they getting out?" "No, he's jettisoning his bombs." As they watched it, the bomber seemed to swell up very gently with a soft whoomp that was audible far across the sky. It became a ball of burning petrol, oil and pyrotechnic compounds. The yellow datum marker that should have marked the approach to Krefeld burned brightly as it fell away, leaving thin trails of sparks. The fireball changed from red to light pink as its rising temperature enabled it to devour new substances from hydraulic fluid and human fat to engine components of manganese, vanadium, and copper. Finally, even the airframe burned. 10 tons of magnesium alloy flared with a strange greenish-blue light. It lit up the countryside beneath it like a slow flash of lightning, and was gone. For a moment, a cloud of dust illuminated by the searchlights floated in the sky, and then even that disappeared. "Gee, sus!" exclaimed Pilot Officer Cornelius Fleming in horror. "No parachutes," pronounced Robin from the nose. The searchlights began moving again. "Flak did it," said the mid-upper gunner, who had the best view of all. Far away, near Utrecht, Fleming saw another master searchlight tilt from the vertical position at which it rested. The top of its beam seemed to explode as it moved across cloud patches. Between the patches, it reached 7 miles into the sky. Unfalteringly, it found a victim. "The stream isn't routed over Leiden," said Fleming to his crew. "All of those aircraft are off course." It sounded not only prim, but callous. But before he could modify the sentiment, the mid-upper gunner said, "I don't give a bugger who they are. It takes the heat off us, and for that I am truly grateful." "Amen. Kettle drums, said Löwenherz. "Lancaster," said the observer, putting away his field glasses. Löwenherz hardly increased speed at all. He inched underneath the huge aeroplane very, very slowly. He looked up through the top of his cabin, and he could see every detail of it. He let its red-hot exhaust pipes pass back overhead until he was exactly underneath the bomber. The two planes roared through the sky in close formation until, in the classic maneuver of the night fighter, Löwenherz pulled the control column back with all his strength. His nose went up closer and closer to the great bomber. The The fighter shuddered as it neared stalling point, hanging on its propellers, thrashing like a drowning man, but suspended and stationary for a moment. Over him came the bomber. "Horrido!" said Löwenherz to tell Bach what he was about to do, and he pressed his gun buttons and raked its belly from nose to tail. The gunfire lit both aircraft with a gentle, greenish light. Löwenherz squinted to preserve his night vision as much as possible. These Richards were nothing but high-powered gun platforms, and the demented hammering of the big cannons deafened the flyers even through their closely fitting helmets, just as the smell of cordite got into their nostrils in spite of their oxygen masks. Working exactly by the instruction book, Löwenherz kept his guns going even after the nose of the Junkers began to fall back towards Earth. Suddenly, the gunfire ended. The drums were empty. 3 20mm MG FF cannons were fitted in the nose of Löwenherz's Junkers 88R. In sequence of threes, there was a thin-cased shell containing 19.5 grams of hexagon A1 high-explosive filling, an explosive armor-piercing shell with a reinforced point and an incendiary that burned at a temperature between 2,000 and 3,000 degrees centigrade for nearly 1 second. Each cannon was firing at the rate of 520 rounds per minute and was fed by a drum containing 60 rounds, so in 7 seconds, all of the cannon drums were empty and 180 shells had been fired at the Volkswagen. The target measured 300 square feet and 38 struck the aeroplane. Theoretically, 20 shells would have constituted an average lethal blow. "My legs!" screamed Fleming. "God, help me! Mother, mother, mother!" The first shell that penetrated the aircraft came through the forward hatch, missing the bomb aimer by only an inch. It exploded on contact with the front turret mounting ring. It dislocated the turret, severed the throttle and rudder control, burst the compressed air tank, and broke open the window spray glycol container. In the airstream, the coolant atomized into a cloud of white mist. 1/26th of a second later, the second shell came through the bomb compartment and exploded under the floor of the navigator's position. In the mysterious manner of explosions, it sucked the navigator downwards, while blowing the astrodome and the wireless operator standing under it, out into the night, unharmed, although without his parachute. 3 shells, 1 He, 1 AP, and 1 incendiary, exploded in glancing contact with the starboard fuselage exterior immediately to the rear of the mid-upper turret. Apart from mortally harming the gunner, the explosion of the HE shell fractured the metal formers at a place where, after manufacture, the rear part of the fuselage is bolted on. The incendiary shell completed the severance. A structural bisection of the Volkswagen occurred 1.5 minutes later and 2,000 feet lower. Long before this, another HE shell passed through the elevator hinge bracket on the tail and blew part of the servo trim tab assembly into the rear turret with such force that it decapitated the rear gunner. Those 6 hits were the most telling ones, but there were 32 others. Some ricocheted off the engines and wings and penetrated the fuselage almost horizontally. He couldn't hold her. He couldn't. Oh, dear God. His arms and legs, dropping through the night like the paper aeroplane. "I'm sorry, chaps," he shouted, for he felt a terrible sense of guilt. Involuntarily, his bowels and bladder relaxed, and he felt himself befouled. "I'm sorry." It was no use for Fleming to scream apologies. There was no one aboard to hear him. He outlived any of his crew. For from 16,000 feet, the wireless operator, falling at 120 mph, the terminal velocity for his weight, reached the ground 90 seconds later. He made an indentation 12 inches deep. This represented a deceleration equivalent to 450 times the force of gravity. He split open like a slaughtered animal and died instantly. Fleming, still strapped into the pilot's seat and aghast at his incontinence, hit the earth along with the front of the fuselage, 2 Rolls-Royce engines and most of the main spar, Some 4 minutes after that, to him it seemed like 4 hours. The air conditioning in Ermine's plotting room wasn't intended to cope with so many off-duty personnel standing round as spectators. In addition, the tension seemed to raise a man's body temperature, as does a meal. August mopped his brow and heard Löwenherz give the traditional victory cry. "Sieg Heil!"
"No, Sieg Heil," said August. Willy came to attention and gave August a formal salute of congratulation in a situation where most men would have shaken him by the hand. There were shuffles and coughs from the onlookers and murmurs of congratulation. The loudspeaker crackled. "He's breaking up," said Löwenherz. "The main spar has snapped and the fuselage is doubling back like a hairpin." Willy wiped the wax marks off the table. "Order, go to Heinz Gustav 1, said August. "Please, via Nordwijk." "Announcement, yes." "Katze 1. "To Philippe," August said. "He might get a visual contact if they are still putting flares down, but I can't call the flak to a stop just because he is overflying them." "He won't hang around," said Willy. "He's a bright fellow." "We're all smart fellows," said August. Willy smiled at August, his ruddy, battered face twisted like a freshly squeezed orange. Löwenherz let the Junkers fall from its vertical position, and after gaining speed, he eased the antlers back and began climbing to fly back through the stream. Morozek took off his seat straps, lit his torch and crawled down into the nose to change the 60-round cannon magazines on the Oerlikons. Löwenherz held the same shallow climb, but a patch of turbulent air caused Morozek to blister his hand upon the breech. Changing the drums was an awkward job even on the ground in daytime, but Morozek never complained. They flew on past Nordwijk without spotting any bombers, although there was lots of flak, including even some brightly coloured 3.7 centimetre stuff from Valkenburg Aerodrome. The Junkers continued right out to the western extreme end of Ermine's range. Those 2 interceptions had been quick and easy, but next time he might need to traverse the whole sector under August's guidance before he made a contact. In Joe for King. Roland Pembroke, the young Scots navigator, had overcompensated for the wind error. His G was unusable owing to German jamming. Now his mistake had brought Joe for King to the Dutch coast 5 miles south of the turning point. Ahead of him, flying through flak and searchlights, there were others who had made the same error of reckoning. "We'll go south of it," said Tommy Carter. "South of Leiden?" said Roland, who had worked out his plot carefully and rather objected to abandoning the flight plan. "South of that muck," said Tommy, waving towards the flak and lights ahead of them. "Okay, boss," said Roland. The brand-new aeroplane had a strong smell of fresh paint and varnish. The controls were hard and stiff under Tommy Carter's hands, and as he turned the wheel it made brittle, cracking sounds. On the other hand, everything worked properly. On his previous aeroplane, 2 or 3 of the instruments were suspect and would stick and lag behind the others. In some ways he liked having this nice new aeroplane. He wondered whether they'd be allowed to keep it. Tommy knew it was a bad idea as soon as he changed on to the new heading. It wasn't only Leiden that was alive with flak. It was this whole coast. The Hague under the starboard wing was damn nearly as bad as Leiden. There were Grossbatterien of dozens of guns and searchlights working under radar control. The whole land was a sparkle with gunfire. Tommy fixed his eyes upon a black region of countryside beyond the gunfire and pushed the throttles forward. "Close your eyes and swallow," said Tommy. "It will soon be gone." The motors screamed loudly. There was an explosion rather nearer than the previous ones. It rocked the wings and made an acrid smell. "There's light stuff too," said Tapper Collins, the bomb aimer. He was in the nose watching ropes of red and yellow tracer curve towards them and fall away at what he knew to be thousands of feet below, but which looked close enough to touch. "Lots of light stuff now, from directly below us. That must be the aerodrome at Valkenburg," said Roland Pembroke. "Jesus," said Tommy. "Leiden to the left of us, Hague to the right of us, and now we are doing a straight and level over a bloody Hun aerodrome. What do you think you're on?"
Charge of the flipping light brigade. Sorry, Tommy, said Roland politely. He didn't point out that the change of route was Tommy's idea. Tommy Carter didn't answer. For at that moment, all of his attention was taken with a searchlight that, having remained vertical and immobile for some time, had tilted and now moved towards them. "It's coming at us," said Collins from his position at the bomb site. "You Burke! Tommy!" said Ben Gallagher. And Tommy Carter was outraged that he should be blamed for something so obviously beyond his control and not of his liking. "Side-slip down the beam," said Collins. He was a veteran, and Tommy respected his experience. This new aeroplane required extra strength to move its controls. He heaved at them and banked until the light was blinding bright. It had them. The cockpit was so brightly lit that it made his eyes ache, and he could only see by almost closing them. The theory was that by side-slipping down the beam, the searchlight would, by continuing to move along, lose you. This searchlight crew seemed to have seen the trick before, although in fact Tommy Carter's side-slip was not nearly violent enough to test the theory. "Fire into the light," Tommy called. "Turn more! I can't reach! I'm full traverse and I can't reach," replied the gunner. Suddenly the light went out. Tommy and Ben tugged at the controls, and the bomber eased out of its steep bank. The flak and searchlight had gone, and the night was agreeably dark and silent. He began to climb again. It was more than a minute before anyone spoke, and then everyone spoke, chattering hysterically and trying to make jokes. "Everyone shut up," said Tommy Carter in the tone he used when he didn't want an argument, what his crew called his copper's voice. "Navigator," said Tommy, with unusual formality of address. "Give me a course, so that we'll join the stream beyond Leiden." 085, said Roland in his prim public school accent. They flew on in a silence broken only by the drone of the motors. "Sorry, boys," said Tommy finally, intimidated by the silence of his crew. "Bloody stupid of me to go south of Leiden. That was a master searchlight," said Collins, the expert. "The blue ones are always radar-controlled. Because arc lamps seem more blue when angled towards the viewer, RAF crews believed that the ones pointing at them, the bluish ones, were the most accurate, i.e. radar-controlled. Luftwaffe crews over Britain believed the same thing, but there were no blue searchlights. "Then why did the flaming thing go off?" said Ben Gallagher. "We were a bit small," said Tommy. "They decided to throw us back and wait for a Sterling. I'd like to know why," said Ben. "It's a secret new weapon that some of our planes carry," theorized Collins. "We'll never know for certain," said Tommy. "So belt up and be grateful." At that moment on the ground near Valkenburg, a young Indian Feldwebel was shouting abuse in Hindustani, which is well suited for that purpose. He watched 3 phlegmatic Signals Regiment mechanics remove the front of his searchlight. In the British Army, before capture, they had been separated by caste. The Wehrmacht, however, had mixed their new volunteers together with only these brightly coloured turbans, lilac, ochre, green, and even pink and white with blue spots to show the difference between himself and the lowest of the pariahs. Again he swore an ancient oath at the mechanics. One of the fools proclaimed it to be an ill omen. It was difficult to contradict him. For today they had been told that the local Dutch civilians had protested at the presence of Kaffirs, and they were to be moved to France with all their new flak equipment. This was one of the first of the new high-performance 210cm lights to be delivered. A beauty, 2.7 million candle power. Damn! He kicked the cable angrily. It was just his luck that, after a first-class contact on the Würzburg and a Tommy in the beam, just then the carbons should go. Sometimes he wished he was back home in Delhi. In the potato fields, a few miles to the west of a house, the young lieutenant who had spoken to August and Max during their delay on the road surveyed his Gross battery. The 2 Hitler Jugend guns were manned and ready. Those boys were always the keenest. Some of the other guns were not completely jacked up, and some were not even uncoupled from their prime movers. It had been a long, hard day, with many delays on the road, and his Oberst complaining every step of the journey. The lieutenant sniffed the air and detected a faint smell of soot and smoke. Whenever the wind was from the south, it brought the aroma of the Ruhr with it. During last month's raids, the air had also carried the smell of fouled earth, brick dust, cordite, and burning buildings. The sound of aircraft engines came suddenly. He phoned to his control room, and when the phone was in his hands, he looked up and saw the glint of moonlight upon a wing. He saw it for only a moment, and it was too high to be more than a speck of light, but it was leaving a condensation trail that glowed in the moonlight. Even had his 8.8-centimeter guns been ready to fire, they couldn't reach that height. The information was passed to Dylan, but already it was superfluous. Other reports showed that the aircraft were 2 Mosquitoes at 32,000 feet. "They are turning at a house," said the plot officer. The operations officer moved his hand to make an arc southwards from a house, pivoting upon the oboe transmitter at Dover. His thumb swiveled across the open country until it encountered the shaded pattern of a large town in the Ruhr. He looked then at the bomber stream's reported position. The heading of the bombers would bring them over the same place. "Krefeld," he said. "I'll bet a week's pay on it." The other officer nodded. He didn't take up the wager. The plan was now clear. On their present heading, the bomber stream would pass over Krefeld at midnight, moving 100 miles an hour faster and turning to approach from the north. The Mosquitoes, with their secret oboe device, would pass over Krefeld 3 minutes earlier. That would be exactly enough time for the colored indicator bombs to mark the target for the heavy bombers. The routes were converging like the rays of light through a burning glass, and tonight attention was focusing on one town: the leaflet raids over northern France. The lone Mosquito that was causing the alarms to sound all the way to Berlin, and the dogleg course that had taken the stream to Nordwijk before turning, were all clearly seen for the ruses they were. The target for tonight was Krefeld. Dylan Control and Duisburg-Fluko began to arrange the defences of the Reich accordingly. In peacetime, a complicated electronic device like oboe would have spent 6 months more on the test bench and 4 or 5 in prototype, and anything up to a year would have passed before they were sold, installed, and in use. But this was war, and oboe was in production. It needed nursing and all the way to the target, and even then it was no surprise to Flying Officer McIntosh when the set went dead 25 miles short of Krefeld. Not a sausage. What a nuisance. The signals were clear as a bell. Then it went dead. "We'll turn back." Then, might as well. We're on the curve, but we'll never find the target with a dud set. Bloody thing. I cancelled a date tonight. You shouldn't have joined. The Mosquito turned abruptly until it faced west to England. There was no sense in going a yard nearer to the Ruhr than was absolutely essential. "Let's get out of here. Mac." There were 2 radio transmitting stations in England from which the signals went to activate oboe. The stations could handle only 2 Mosquitoes every 10 minutes. The 2 planes that should mark the target for the very first bombers to arrive were now reduced to 1 plane. That one was piloted by Pilot Officer Alan Hill. His observer was Peter Hutchinson. They had done everything according to the book. They had flown at 32,000 feet. For only at this height were the signals able to reach over the radar horizon. At a point 50 miles north of Krefeld, they had turned southwards. Keeping the steady beat of the signals in his ears, the pilot had banked his wing to fly a gentle curve that would, at the moment the signal from the second transmitter reached him, bring him at the right distance from Krefeld to allow for the forward movement through the air of the 250-ton target indicator bombs. They did not know that the accompanying Mosquito had turned away with its oboe device out of action. Nor did they know that they were accompanied by a German aeroplane up in this region of the sky that was almost the stratosphere. It was a specially equipped Ju-88S, in which the GM1 system injected nitrous oxide into the superchargers and thus provided oxygen that boosted its performance by nearly 20%. Its endurance was measured in minutes, and a few nights previously it had used up its ha-ha device just as it caught sight of the mosquito. Tonight there had been no miscalculation. Tonight the moonlight had made the upper reaches of the sky into a floodlit arena. "Bombs armed," reported the observer. At the speed they were going, Krefeld was only 2 minutes away. There was suddenly a thumping sound and the controls were wrenched from the pilot's grasp. The panel was bent and torn, and the glass from its instruments flew in all directions. 2 Perspex panels had suddenly gone white, and the sky was no longer to be seen through them. Even when the bangs stopped, the engines were screaming an octave above their normal tone. The mosquito performed a flick roll, steadied itself for a moment, and then put its nose up and stalled. As he dived the aircraft to regain control, they saw the Ju-88 far away on the port beam. Its wings shone in the moonlight as it turned to find them for a second attack. "Fire!" said Peter Hutchinson. "What with?" said Alan Hill angrily, until he noticed that the port engine was coughing blue flame and spitting orange sparks, and his few remaining instrument needles were collapsing. He wrenched at the tiny jettison box by his side and tore a nail as he broke the safety wires. There was a lurch as 2 250 Bion target indicator bombs, each almost as big as a man, fell out of the bomb bay. And then he struggled with the box for what seemed like hours, until the other 2 went. Relieved of the weight of its bomb load, the aeroplane responded more readily to its controls. He kept the nose down and headed desperately for the cloud bank, but it was still 2,000 feet below him as the Ju-88 came in again. More pieces of wing disappeared as the cannon shells punched holes through the wood. "To hear you 2 young fellows talk, you'd think the Germans had no fighter planes. They don't as far as we're concerned." "Dad, we're too high for them." "Well, I didn't say this in front of your mother, Alan, but mark my words. Your Jerry is a damn good engineer, and if he wants to get up to you one of these nights, he'll do it. Drink up, Dad. We've 2 more days of leave yet," and change the subject. "I know, your job's too hush-hush to talk to your father about. Peter, jump. She's coming to pieces." Peter didn't move. That last attack must have done it. Please God, don't let that Junkers come round again. In the Junkers, the fuel warning lights were on. He'd had his 45 minutes fun, and now the nitrous oxide was used. He turned away from the mosquito. It was done for. He could see that. He wondered if Luftwaffe High Command would let him claim it. They were so keen to keep the ha-ha secret. Alan Hill held the stick with one hand and shook Peter frantically with the other. There was no sign of life. He grabbed at the flying helmet and turned the head to look into his friend's glassy eyes. As he shook him, the oxygen mask fell aside, and he had difficulty in refixing it. Peter's face was covered with fresh blood. Down where the bomber stream was flying, it was cold, colder than the coldest of domestic freezers, but up here it was even colder. 60 degrees below zero, and the air was rarefied and its pressure fatally low for a human lung. Alan undid his safety belt, and Peter's too, before he put the stick over. When the mosquito was upside down, he fell out of his seat. He tried to pull his observer with him, but Peter's leg was caught under the bent instrument panel. He tugged at Peter's arm, but that too became bloody even as he watched. Alan took one last gulp of oxygen, and then, holding his breath, he let himself fall. He dropped a long, long way before pulling the ripcord, but even so he had slight frostbite and lost the joint of an index finger that stuck to the metal handle. Perfectly. The canopy bloomed above him. He landed in a ploughed field 2 miles from the Dutch border. His only other injury was a bad cut on his right hand that must have happened during the first attack. He realized then that the blood on Peter's face and arm was from this cut. He asked himself if he could have saved Peter's life. Allen was interned together with other bomber crews and was thus not interrogated in the way he would have been had they guessed him to be an oboe pilot. He spent the rest of the war in a prison camp and died aged 49 in a motor car accident in Liverpool. And yet there was not a day when he did not ask himself that same question. A layer of cold air lay close upon the great district of the Ruhr, untroubled by any wind. This cold, still air trapped smoke from the furnaces and factories and held it like a grey, woolen blanket. Water droplets had built up against this layer and formed a roof as dense and flat and smooth as a sheet of grey aspic, what today we call smog. One target indicator, jettisoned by the oboe mosquito, went into this layer near the Rhine at Duisburg. The second went into the Rhine. 1.5 minutes and 9 miles later, the second two landed on the southeast edge of Altgarten, detonated by barometric pressure at 1,000 feet. Each marker bomb spewed benzol, rubber, and phosphorus for 100 yards in all directions, so that there were two pools of red-colored fire easily seen by the bomber stream 4 miles above the earth. It was Altgarten's fate to be on the track of the bombers as they flew from the coast towards Krefeld. Had the bombers passed a few more miles to one side or the other, then the stream might not have seen the burning TIs waiting to be bombed. It was an extra misfortune for the town that the markers dropped on its far side, for the creepback would start to bring the bombing right across the town towards the approaching stream. Each crew would bomb as early as they could do so without shame. Then they would turn away before the concentration of guns and searchlights that guarded the Ruhr on Altgarten's far side. Perhaps some of the more experienced crews would not have been deceived by the markers into bombing the little town, except that to the H-2S radar the acres of glasshouses that were Altgarten's special pride appeared on the radar screen like enormous factories. The first finder circled twice before putting flares down to the southeast of the markers, trying to get a visual confirmation. Then a supporter, on his first trip, put a string of high explosive between the flares and the red TIs, and a second supporter did the same. The last of these bombs hit the Venlo Road and set fire to a gas main. Tommy Carter in Joe for King II was a backer-up. He arrived 5 minutes early and put his 4 green markers onto the reds. 1,000 feet above Altgarten, 60 pyrotechnic candles were ejected from each marker. Each was suspended under a tiny parachute. Falling in close proximity, and according to wind and weight, they assumed the shape of a bunch of fiery grapes or, if bottom-heavy, a Christmas tree. Within 10 minutes, dozens of supporters and finders had dumped their flares and she upon Altgarten, and inevitably the release points were creeping back northwest across the town. Meanwhile, at 0+3 minutes, an oboe mosquito arrived exactly on time over Krefeld and marked the real target with 4 perfectly placed reds. They burned unseen by the bombing force. By now attention had been centered upon Altgarten, and the plan had begun to go terribly wrong. Afterwards there were those who said that the burgomaster was pleased when the first flares dropped near Altgarten. Karl Keller, one of the waiters from the Stube, said that he'd left there with a smile on his face after the warning had been delivered to him. But, as one of the civil defense messengers said, it was his birthday and he had just finished a banquet in his honor. Why shouldn't he be smiling? An official car was waiting outside Frenzel's, and the burgomaster was taken at high speed through the empty streets to the Rat House, where a policeman saluted him smartly as he descended the steps to the heavily sandbagged control room. Inside, 3 civil defense girls were at their desks, and 2 Hitler-Jugend cyclists were uniformed and at attention in the anteroom. Red Christmas tree flares 1 mile to the southeast, 0129. The girl smiled. That's probably somewhere in Frau Kirsten's fields. Mark it in on the map. Fräulein. The telephonist said. Fluko reports red markers near Duisburg, 0130, the same aircraft. Probably. Mark that in too, said the burgomaster calmly. We must know which way the aircraft are approaching. The burgomaster hung up his hat and sat behind his desk. The yellow desk lamp made a rim around his profile. He passed his long white fingers over the 3 phones. Blotter, pad and sharpened pencils, as if to reassure himself that all was arranged to his orders. He had never been under air attack before. He was determined to work by the rules. For many months he had studied the instruction books and reports. Tonight he would use his store of knowledge. Suddenly he stood up. It was the first supporter aircraft, putting down his stick of HE. 6 500-ton medium-capacity bombs fell in a line about 70 yards apart. Had there been an 8th bomb, it would have fallen upon the rat house. "What are they bombing out there?" asked the burgomaster, looking at the wall of his office as though some mystic force might allow him to see through it and thus solve the problem. "Frau Kirsten's potatoes," said the telephonist. "Perhaps they are trying to starve us out." The burgomaster froze her smile with a look. The First World War had left him with the belief that jokes under fire were only one step away from hysteria. There was a rattle at the door handle, and another Hitler Jugendboy appeared. He was excited and flushed with the exertion of pedaling. "The road is on fire, Herr Bürgermeister." "What do you mean?" "The road." "A thin white flame as tall as a house," said the boy. "Fräulein Eva." "Tell the gasmeister, Junge." "Give the exact position of the fire." "Fräulein Bertha." "Prop something under that door to hold it open so that there is free access to the control room. Tomorrow I want that door handle mended properly. It's nearly a week since I asked for it to be done." "Yes, Herr Bürgermeister," said the girl. Tommy Carter's Joe for King came steadily across Altgarten and released a bomb load which included the green TIs. "And connect me to the waterworks master too." The telephonist pushed the key continuously, but the phone was unanswered. The waterworks master had hurried away from the burgomaster's birthday party, keen to prove that he knew his duty as well as the next man, but he'd forgotten the keys of his office. He walked across to the filter beds and the great water tank. There was nothing for him to do. He found the half-finished cigar in his top pocket and relit it and began a gentle stroll. There were red flashes in the sky. It seemed very close, but he knew such appearances could be deceptive. The sound of aeroplanes grew louder. He often watched them pass over on their way to the Ruhr. Sometimes he had seen them hit and burning in the sky like comets. The waterworks master was Altgarten's first victim. When coloured marker bombs came down, he began to run, but he was swamped by cascading pools of green fire. And then came high explosive, and his body was thrown into the air and buried in the churned soil amongst potato roots and splinters of tree. The raid was no novelty for the Technische Nothilfe Battalion. They came out of their huts completely equipped before the first stick of flares had guttered and died. Their heavy trucks, with the wide white identifying band painted round them and the white bicycles strapped to the tailboards, were drawn up in convoy order, and the men swung aboard in the darkness as they had done 1,000 times before. This was just another air raid for the Tennos, with the subtle distinction that this time they did not have to go to it. It had come to them. First, the car decelerates and moves slowly enough for the driver to see the house numbers. Finally, it stops. The men's voices are low in tone and volume, and their rhythms imply orders and assent. Doors slam gently and metal-studded boots click loudly in the night air. The door knocker rat-a-tats. All over Europe in 1943, ears had become sensitive to such a sequence of sounds. At 11:45 on the night of June the 31st, old Herr Voss, the tailor, cocked his head and listened fearfully. Herr Voss was a short, plump man of 59. The crown of his head was bald, but a natural wave gave him curls across the ears and over his collar. He was a talented amateur baritone, and as recently as 1940 he had performed at a local concert. His wife had once been a noted Lieder singer. They liked music of all kinds and had a large collection of records, ranging from American jazz to Beethoven quartets, and of course many choral works. Each evening he dressed in his black velvet jacket and tasseled smoking hat. His daily housekeeper left them a simple cold meal, and after finishing it, he smoked his pipe, and he and his wife listened to music, often until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. At present, his wife was visiting their only daughter and son-in-law in Freiburg. Although alone in the house, he kept to the usual ritual. Voss turned down the music on the radio. For a moment he stood listening. Then he shuffled down the hall in his carpet slippers to open the front door. Even before he got there, the knocker sounded again. "All right, all right," called the old man irritably. "Everyone is in such a hurry." It was dark outside, and he could just make out the silhouette of a steel helmet. "It's the front room curtain again, is it?" said old Voss, his voice changing into a soft apology. "It's the cat that moves it." "Voss," said the man, and now old Voss looked at him a second time. By the shaded light he could see that it was a Wehrmacht steel helmet the man was wearing, not a Luftschutz pattern. "Voss?" repeated the soldier. His voice was strange. "Yes," said Herr Voss. He tried to say it doubtfully, so as to retain the option of denying it. "This is the house, sir, or..." called the soldier in the thick, throaty Russian of the Caucasian mountains. Another man came out of the darkness. "Get the bundle," he said in halting Russian. He was taller and slimmer than the Hedui, with a leather overcoat that was badly damaged on the elbows and lapels. "I'm the one who telephoned," said the tall one. His voice had the sing-song lilt of the Rhineland. "Come in," said Voss. They both came into his sitting room. The Hilfsfreiwilliger, auxiliary volunteer, was loaded under 3 long sacking bundles. He had them upon his shoulder, and they sagged with their own weight. "On the floor was," said the tall one. He was a pale-faced young man with tired eyes and a hooked nose. Like an owl, thought Voss. The man opened his coat to search for cigarettes and revealed the black SS rank patches on his collar. The foreign volunteer was a Feldwebel. His uniform was at least a size too small for him. On his sleeve there was a yellow dragon on a bright blue shield. "Galician, 14th SS. "Eh?" said Voss. "How do you know?" asked Fischer, taking off his coat. "I tailor uniforms. I probably know more about army insignia than you do. And your Leibstandarte, eh?" The old man smiled, noticing the LAH epaulets and new cuffband on Fischer's arm. He thought them the trappings of a poser. Now he looked more closely at Fischer's Knight's Cross. "We're posted to Hitler Jugend Division," said Fischer angrily. He threw his leather coat over a chair. He hadn't wanted the old man to know which unit they belonged to, but lying was complicated. Still, there wasn't much danger that this little crook would dare complain about an SS officer. The Hiwi dumped the bundles on the floor, unsheathed a bayonet, and neatly sliced one open. He unrolled it with the toe of his boot. "From the National Museum in Kharkov," said Fischer. "Caucasian?" "Cuba," nodded the officer. "Nearly 300 years old. It could tell a few stories." The HIWE flipped back the corner like a professional carpet dealer. "Look at it," said Fischer. "Notice the warp threads on 2 different levels. Look at the border." "Kufix," said Voss. "Exactly," said Fischer. "You know a thing or two about carpets. I've bought them before." "So I heard," said Fischer dryly. "You'll be a fool not to buy this one. It's a museum piece." "Everyone says they've got a museum piece," said Voss, rubbing a corner of the carpet. "Yes," said Fischer, "but not everyone takes it out of a Ruski museum at the point of a gun." The HIWE watched them carefully as they spoke, trying to understand Voss's fast, guttural Platt Deutsch, as much like Dutch as German, as, suddenly, comprehending. The Hiwi laughed and revealed a set of bad teeth. Fischer watched Voss's face as he examined the stitches. "See how thick the base is? How much? 10,000? Reichsmark?" "No, Pfennig," said Fischer sarcastically. Voss ran his fingers across the flowers and birds, soft reds and greens. The colours shone in the electric light. "It's worth it," admitted Voss. "Worth twice as much," said Fisher. He went to a silver box on the coffee table. "I'll take a cigarette," he announced. "Please do," said Voss. He looked at the other bundles. "What are the others?" "Modern Shervans." "They won't interest you. You know too much about carpets." The old man smiled at the compliment, but the smile was frozen on his face as the first stick of bombs came down. Immediately after that, they heard the second bomb load go. The farthest one was a quarter of a mile behind Frau Kirsten's, but the last one was upon the slum housing behind the gasworks. Voss and the two soldiers hurried to the door. Outside, the night was as bright as day. Tommy Carter's green marker flares were hanging in the sky. Each cluster spread out towards its base like a Christmas tree. There were other Christmas trees, one over the brewery and another near the church. To the southeast, the sky was still glowing red from the mosquitoes' eyes. "Markers?" said Fisher. "Those green flares form the corners of a square into which the other planes will drop their bombs." It was a common mistake, made because people on the ground didn't realize the big margins of error within which the bombers operated. Actually, Tapper Collins was trying to put all of the green Christmas trees onto the same aiming point. Fisher had no sooner spoken than a salvo struck the northern side of the town. Amongst the 500 Lee bombs there was a 4,000 Lubie cookie that made the ground rock. The echoes rolled through the narrow streets of the old town, and Voss and the two soldiers found themselves full length on the road without remembering how they got there. Another Lancaster started its bomb run. Voss saw the two soldiers holding their hands over their ears to protect their eardrums. He did the same. They waited until the next ear-splitting explosions had rocked the earth. "Have you got a cellar?" called Fisher. "Yes," said Voss. "Let's get into it." Voss eyed their Kubelwagen parked at the curb. He had half hoped that they would decide to hasten away, but on the other hand, he coveted the carpet. He had never seen one quite so fine. Except in museums. The window of the next-door house rattled open. "Herr Voss, is that you?" "Yes." "It is," said Voss. "Are they bombing us?" asked Anna Louisa. The officer laughed. "They are, my dear," said the old man. "You'd better bring the child into my cellar." "Thank you, Herr Voss." "And hurry," called Fisher. They scrambled to their feet and hurried indoors. The Lancaster of Sandy Sanderson, engineer leader and squadron dandy, released 10 canisters of incendiary bombs exactly at the aiming point. From each canister tumbled 90 magnesium sticks. For a moment, 900 incendiary bombs hung together in the gaping bomb doors like a cluster of iron filings dangling from a magnet. Then the airstream punched into them, and they sprinkled out over the town all the way from Mauerstrasse to Party HQ near the church. Each Vortelbe incendiary struck the ground with a sound like the crack of a whip and a white flash. Then they burned and flared fiercely. The three men watched from the door. One of the incendiaries hit the ground only a yard ahead of the Kubelwagen, and the Hibby Feldwebel ran back to kick the bomb along the gutter and then kicked after it the red and white fragments of burning magnesium that it had scattered. "Where's the cellar, Herr Voss?" said the officer, and old Voss produced a heavy ring of keys and unlocked the cellar door. His keys jangling in his nervous fingers. The three men ushered the girl and the little boy down the stone steps. Once they were there, the soldiers could see why the old man had been reluctant to allow them to see his air raid shelter. It was a treasure house. There was a glass-fronted case full of silver and a box full of glassware, all wrapped carefully in newspaper. Squeezed among the antiques and boxes of goodness knows what, there were 4 comfortable old chairs, and even a telephone extension. Calling it his air raid shelter was a convenient rationalization for arranging a room in which the old man could survey his loot in privacy and comfort. Voss lit the oil lamp, but the electric lights were bright enough to make it unnecessary. Anna Louisa laid the child, Hansel, upon an armchair. He was sleepy, and she arranged a blanket round his head to muffle the noise. It was the 2,000-pound high-explosive bomb from Tommy Carter's plane that hit the corner of Munchenstrasse and Postgasse, only a block away from Voss's house. In the cellar, it shook the dust from the shelves. Old Voss coughed, and the HEWE sneezed, and then laughed uproariously. Outside, the dark street was clouded in brick dust. The bomb had sliced 30 yards from the apartment block like a segment of cake, leaving brightly coloured layers of wallpapered rooms exposed. Sloping up to the second floor, there was a mound of rubble with bricks, broken furniture, an upturned bath, and slabs of unbroken wall poking out of it. There were freak escapes, a mirror on the wall, pictures unscathed, and a parlour-maid found stark naked, but quite unharmed in the garden at the rear. She had been asleep on the top floor. Old Storp, the blockwart, an overcoat over his pyjamas, came wide-eyed through the dust and darkness to meet the Tenno engineers. He had a scrap of paper in his hands, and he shouted loudly to make himself heard above the explosions. 18 people altogether, all of them sheltering in the cellar. The TNO man eyed the tall mound of bricks and rubbish. "We'll never get them out," he said briefly. With a terrible finality, he chalked 18 on a piece of masonry and turned away. "You must," shouted the blockwart. "My wife's in there." "It's no use," shouted the Tenno man. A bomb exploded nearby, and he crouched down. "It's the water pipe that we must fix." The blockwart started to lift one of the heavy wooden beams aside, but finding it unmovable, he grabbed at loose bricks. "I'm coming." "Bertha," he shouted. "Don't be frightened, my love." He seemed no longer to hear the bombs dropping. He worked feverishly to clear a way to the cellar, but inside it they were all dead. It was the sound of that same high-explosive bomb that brought Herr Voss back up from his cellar. Its blast distorted the 9-inch spun-iron water pipe that ran past his house, and its lid-wool caulking had cracked badly enough for a steady flow of water to run into the Voss cellar. At first the flow was no faster than a kitchen tap, but the water pressure opened the gap and did further damage to the caulking, so that soon the water had formed a large pool and ran in streams under the easy chairs and wetted the bottoms of the wooden boxes. There was no drain in the cellar, and Voss knew that unless the engineers got to the pipe soon, it would be completely flooded. He hurried up the steps, anxious about the damage the water might do to his paintings and carpets. The 2 soldiers remained in the cellar with Anna Louisa for 10 more minutes. Above them, the bombs were shaking the house to its foundations. Hansel awoke and began to cry gently. "We'll go soon," said the officer. He got to his feet and began to unwrap some silver and glass that was packed into one of the boxes. He selected 3 Georgian silver teapots and a cream jug and placed them carefully on the armchair. Although not a word passed between them, the Feldwebel found a sack and put the silver into it. The officer selected an ancient flintlock pistol from the wall and found a red silk Kashan rug wrapped in newspaper on the shelf. He rolled it into the bundle of carpets they had brought with them. "What are you doing?" asked Anna Louisa. She smiled as she said it, hoping that they were only joking. "We are old friends of Herr Voss," said the officer. "These are things we have bought from him." "I don't believe you," said Anna Louisa. She walked across the cellar to the steps and called to Herr Voss, but no answer came. "He's probably dead," said the officer. "Let's wait for him," suggested Anna Louisa, standing in his path and holding up her arm to prevent him passing. Fischer drew back his fist and punched her in the face as hard as he could. She knew he had broken her front teeth even before she felt the pain of the blow. The force of it threw her back against the wooden boxes. She twisted her ankle, and an antique decanter fell and smashed on the stone floor. She moaned in pain, and, holding her face in her hands, she rocked to and fro, trying to comfort herself. When Hansel began to cry loudly, she gradually opened her eyes. The men had gone, and so had the sack full of silver and the carpet. She pulled Hansel close to her. "It's all right, baby. Everything will be all right." Her mouth was swollen and her voice was strange because of her broken teeth, but she went on saying it in order to comfort herself. The water was still gurgling into the cellar, but she no longer cared. No one did. Upstairs, the two soldiers moved briskly through the house. There was a moment's pause in the gunfire and bombs after the first bombers passed over. It was dark, and there was a foul smell of brick dust and disturbed sewage. They put the bundles into the back of the Kübelwagen and drove away. In the gutter, only a few yards from the house, was the body of Herr Voss. The soldiers didn't recognize him. There were other bodies in the street too. They hardly glanced at them. They had seen many dead bodies.